There are quiet hours when something inside you begins to gather almost without permission. Not in a loud way, not in a way that announces itself. It forms slowly, as if the silence around you becomes a kind of container that allows everything internal to rise just a little closer to the surface. You don't have to look for it. It's already there, waiting for the moment the world stops tugging at your attention. This feeling, this fullness does not push or intrude. It simply exists, warm and rounded, like a soft presence that's been dimmed all day and can finally breathe. You notice it only because the rest of the world has settled. The noise that usually fills the edges of your thoughts is quieter now, leaving enough space for the inner layers to expand, not demandingly, just naturally. It may sit somewhere in the center of you, though center might not be the right word. More like a quiet area beneath your awareness that subtly expands upward. You don't feel weight exactly, more of a density, a softly held concentration of emotional presence that isn't asking to be named. It's simply there, in the same way a faint warmth lingers in a room without being noticed until everything else grows still. As you continue to sit in this quiet, the fullness begins to take on shape gently, almost in slow motion. Not like a thought forming. Thoughts have sharp edges. This has none. It spreads in wide gradients, drifting outward the longer you stay present with it. You sense its outline more clearly, though nothing about it becomes more intense. If anything, it becomes softer the more you acknowledge it. There is a moment in these dim hours when the inside of you feels more spacious than it did before. The fullness doesn't expand because it grows stronger, but because the space around it relaxes. It's like your inner world loosens its grip and allows the feeling to settle wherever it needs to. The night has a way of opening these quiet internal rooms that stay closed during the day rooms you only enter when everything outside has finally exhaled. As the feeling settles, your awareness drifts toward it without effort. You don't focus sharply. You don't analyze. You hover around its edges, sensing the faint shifts in temperature and texture. The emotional air inside you thickens softly warmly, not in a constricting way, but in the same way fog makes the night feel closer, quieter, fuller. A subtle movement occurs beneath the fullness. Not a change, but a rearrangement. A small internal adjustment you might only notice because the rest of your mind is so calm. The noisy layers that stay loud during the day fall silent, leaving only this, a soft center surrounded by the dim warmth of night. Everything inside slows to match the outer quiet breath thought sensation, even the tiny pulses of feeling that usually slip past unnoticed. You don't need to decide what this fullness means. It isn't a message. It isn't a story. It isn't a memory rising to the surface. It's simply the shape emotion takes when it has room to exist without tension. When it no longer has to compress itself to fit between tasks, conversations, responsibilities, distractions. When it is allowed to be just a presence, neither positive nor negative, neither heavy nor light, neither something to fix nor something to understand. There's a kind of acceptance that naturally forms when you stop trying to interpret what you feel. It isn't resignation, it's allowing. Allowing the inner world to be what it is, exactly as it is, without trying to force clarity or structure onto it. In that allowance, the fullness changes again, not in size, but in quality. It becomes gentler, less defined, more integrated into the quiet around it. Your breathing finds its way into this softness, though you don't try to match it. It happens on its own, a low, slow rhythm. Each breath seems to glide through the fullness, smoothing its edges and dissolving whatever small pockets of tension remained. The more the night deepens, the smoother everything inside becomes. Not emptier, just more even. There's a quiet clarity that appears when the fullness reaches this stage. Not the clarity of understanding, but the clarity of noticing. You become aware of how much space this feeling takes, how steadily it sits, how soft it remains, even as it grows more defined. You may sense its surface shift in tiny ways, like ripples on a calm body of water, but nothing ever breaks the stillness. Everything inside stays low, warm, gentle. In this quiet recognition, something loosens inside you, a kind of internal exhale. Not something dramatic, but something subtle, a release of the need to organize the feeling, or name it, or turn it into something that fits inside a sentence. It doesn't need that. It only needs your presence, soft, steady, and unhurried. As the night continues, the fullness spreads slightly, drifting into the surrounding space, like warmth radiating outward. It's still one feeling, still one presence, but now it blends more easily with the rest of your inner world. The boundaries soften. The density becomes a quiet glow. Everything inside feels more cohesive, more fluid, more at ease. You may not realize it at first, but the simple act of noticing this fullness changes the atmosphere around you. Not by dissolving it, but by letting it exist without resistance. What once felt like a concentrated shape becomes something wide open and softly luminous. The quiet around you becomes part of the feeling itself, and the feeling becomes part of the quiet. Nothing about this asks for resolution. Nothing asks for interpretation. Nothing asks to be solved. This is just recognition, the first gentle step into the deeper stillness waiting further inside. There are moments in the night when the quiet around you opens just wide enough for something inside to shift a little deeper. Not dramatically, not with intensity, just a soft descent, like an inner layer settling into a calmer position. You may feel it without trying the way you sense slight changes in air pressure, subtle, steady, nearly invisible if you're not paying attention. But in these late hours, when everything external loosens its hold, the internal becomes easier to feel. The fullness that began earlier doesn't grow heavier. It simply becomes more defined, as if moving from the edges of your awareness toward a more central place. It lowers gently, finding a spot slightly deeper within you. A small shift downward, slow, and unforced. You recognize it because the quiet allows you to notice details that would normally dissolve into the noise of the day. There's a warmth surrounding it now, thin and diffused, wrapping the feeling in a muted glow. Not brightness, not heat, just a gentle warmth that creates a sense of safety around the fullness. You can sense the temperature of the internal space changing in subtle ways, settling into something even and stable. No sharpness, no edges, no urgency. Your awareness begins to move with this shift, almost as if it's being carried along by the fullness itself. You don't lean in deliberately. You follow naturally. The internal pace slows even more, mirroring the softness of the night. Thoughts no longer crowd one another. Instead, they stretch out like thin lines of quiet drifting through a dim room. Each one moves at a controlled pace, giving the fullness enough room to deepen without disturbance. There's a feeling of horizontal expansion that happens before the descent completes. The fullness broadens slightly, spreading sideways as though making space for itself in the deeper layers. This widening is not about increasing intensity. It's about finding a balanced shape that can settle more comfortably. The emotional field around it expands too, softening in response. Everything inside feels like it has more room to breathe. You may notice how your attention glides across this inner space with a kind of weightless motion. It doesn't press or dig. It simply drifts, brushing against the warmth that surrounds the fullness. Each pass reveals faint textures, subtle gradients of emotion that weren't visible before. They don't form stories or memories. They don't carry meaning. They're just textures, soft, warm, slightly dense, gently shifting. The more you stay with it, the more the fullness begins to anchor itself. It doesn't sink abruptly. It settles like something lowering itself onto a cushion, slow, gentle, deliberate, without force. There's a sense of grounding in this movement, a quiet reminder that not all inner shifts require clarity. Some just need stillness to finish forming. In this deeper layer, thoughts lose their sharper outlines. You may sense them as wide shadows moving across a dim surface. Feelings that usually speak through language retreat into softer shapes. The internal world becomes more atmospheric, less structured. The fullness fits into this softened landscape easily, almost like it belongs here more naturally than it did in the upper layers. A subtle pull toward the center of yourself emerges not a tension, but a gentle gravity. It guides your awareness inward, helping you sense the fullness with more clarity but less pressure. It feels like the inner world is aligning itself around the presence of this feeling, adjusting quietly and without resistance. You don't need to hold the feeling tightly. You don't need to trace its outline precisely. The night encourages a softer way of sensing one where you let things appear at their own pace, in their own form, without expecting them to be anything other than what they are. In this softness, the fullness begins to feel more natural, less like a separate element, and more like a part of your internal atmosphere. There's a small, nearly imperceptible release that happens when the fullness reaches the depth it was moving toward. A loosening of something inside you, a quiet confirmation that the feeling has landed where it was meant to land. The emotional air feels warmer here, more, even more stable. You sense that nothing needs to change. Nothing needs to be solved. This depth is simply where the fullness rests most comfortably. As you remain in this state, the surrounding quiet feels thicker. Not heavy, just more present. The kind of quiet that softens everything it touches. It spreads through your awareness, smoothing any remaining sharpness in your thoughts. Even emotions outside the fullness begin to settle, finding their own gentle rhythm in the dim stillness. You may realize that the fullness has become easier to sit with. The deeper it moves, the softer it feels. What initially seemed dense now feels warm. What felt like a concentrated point now feels like a small field of presence, something that exists not to be examined, but simply to be felt. Your breathing shifts with it. Without intending to, you breathe a little deeper, a little slower, as though your body understands the internal descent and matches it. The fullness doesn't change shape because of your breath, but the two movements complement each other, one settling, one softening. There is no rush to move past this moment, no pressure to interpret the feeling, no need to reshape anything. This gentle deepening is enough. It is its own quiet motion, a movement into the parts of yourself that only become accessible when the world is dim and still. You can stay here without holding on to the feeling. It will rest on its own. There is a moment in the quiet when the feeling inside doesn't rise or intensify, but moves a little closer, as if sliding toward the center of your awareness. It doesn't push. It doesn't ask for attention. It simply drifts forward in the way soft things do, slowly, naturally, without intention. You may sense this shift the same way you sense the temperature change when stepping into a calmer room. It's subtle, but unmistakable. The fullness that settled earlier begins to reshape itself into something more immediate, still soft, still warm, still wrapped in dim quiet. But now it sits at a distance where you can feel its presence without effort. Each moment in the low light brings it into clearer focus, though nothing becomes sharper. Clarity here is not sharpness. It is nearness. It is the awareness that something inside has stepped into a gentler position. Around it, the internal landscape smooths again. The mind trims away the lingering noises it held on to, smoothing the edges of your thoughts until all that remains are slow, faint traces drifting through your awareness. These traces don't form images or stories. They move the way thin clouds pass across a muted sky, steady, continuous, without interruption. Everything within you is adjusting to match the softness of the night. A layer of warmth gathers around the fullness, but not in a way that draws attention to itself. It's more like the air around the feeling has become slightly denser, holding it in place with a muted glow. You don't feel heat, you feel comfort. The kind of comfort that forms when something has finally reached a position where it doesn't need to move anymore. This warmth acts like a loose frame, shaping the feeling just enough to make its presence known. Your awareness drifts gently around it, not in a circular way, not repetitively, more like passing by, sensing, pausing, flowing onward. Each time you drift near the feeling, you sense a faint movement within it, like an internal shift that happens beneath its surface. These movements are slow, almost imperceptible, but they let you know the feeling is alive in its own quiet way. Nothing inside is static. Everything is moving at the pace of the night. You may notice your thoughts thinning further, the chatter dissolving into a kind of soft mental haze. This haze isn't confusion. It is quiet. A quiet that acts like a buffer between you and the world outside. It keeps external concerns at a distance, allowing your attention to rest here in this subtle shift happening inside you. With fewer distractions, it becomes easy to sense the faint emotional currents flowing beneath the fullness. There's a delicate alignment happening within your inner world. As the fullness moves slightly inward, everything around it falls into place. Emotions that usually scatter or stretch during the day come into a narrow, gentle focus. They drift toward the warmth and settle close to it. Thoughts don't interrupt this process. They hover at the edges, softened into harmless shapes. Even your breath begins to follow the slow rhythm forming inside you. The softness of this shift can feel like a quiet reassurance, not because it reveals answers or insights, but because it shows that feelings can change shape without growing heavier. They can move inward without creating pressure. They can become clearer without demanding interpretation. You begin to understand that clarity doesn't always require definition. Sometimes, clarity is simply recognizing the truth of what's present. The warmth wrapped around the fullness begins to spread. It extends outward in thin layers, merging with the surrounding quiet. The emotional air grows heavier in the gentlest way, not oppressive, but grounding. There's a sense of descending into a deeper layer of yourself, not downward, but inward, where everything feels muted and calm. Each breath moves through this inner space as though smoothing it further. You may begin to feel the internal shift as a soft glow that fills more of your awareness. It isn't bright. It isn't illuminating anything specific. It's a diffuse glow, like the warmth of something resting quietly. The more you sit with it, the easier it becomes to recognize its contours, rounded, subtle, familiar. Not because the feeling is becoming stronger, but because you are becoming more aware of its texture. There is something steady about this moment, a kind of internal stillness that aligns with the emotional drift. The fullness no longer feels like a separate presence. It feels like a part of the broader quiet that surrounds it. The distinction between feeling and atmosphere becomes softer, blurrier. Everything inside moves toward a single shared tone, dim, warm, expansive. This is where the night does its quiet work. It doesn't change what you feel. It changes your proximity to what you feel. It softens your resistance. It loosens the emotional surface. It gives your inner world room to breathe, room to reshape itself naturally. With less noise, the feeling becomes easier to experience without fear or interpretation. You can sit with it the way you sit with a thought that doesn't need resolution, calmly, gently, silently. As the shift continues, you begin to sense the fullness drifting not away, but deeper into itself. A soft, inward curl, a folding motion, a movement that suggests settling without closure. You understand intuitively that this is just the first descent, an early step into a quieter chamber of your inner life. Nothing is final. Nothing is expected. The feeling is simply finding a place to rest where it can remain present without pressing against anything. Your awareness meets it there. You don't reach. You don't follow. You just allow your attention to settle into the same softness. And for a moment, both you and the feeling occupy the same low, calm space, sharing a quiet that feels deeper than your breath. This is the shift, the first soft movement inward, the first deepening of the fullness, the first sign that together you and the quiet are forming a new space. A space where the inner world feels less crowded, less tense, less demanding, just quietly full in a way that matches the night. There comes a point in the quiet where the fullness inside no longer feels like something distant or vague. It becomes something you acknowledge directly, not with effort, not with interpretation, but with a gentle, wordless recognition. You sense it settling into a depth that feels more stable than before. Not deeper in the sense of intensity, but deeper in presence, as if it has aligned itself more firmly with the quiet that surrounds it. The feeling doesn't rise or expand. Instead, it steadies. It finds a position that feels natural, as though this is where it always belonged, but didn't have the space to rest until now. There is a softness around it, a muted warmth that acts almost like a cushion, supporting the feeling without shaping it. This warmth doesn't change the fullness. It simply holds it in place, making it easier to sit with. Your awareness approaches it differently now. Earlier, you noticed it. Now you recognize it. That shift is subtle but meaningful. Recognition doesn't require clarity. It doesn't require understanding. It's simply an acceptance that something inside you exists and that tonight it's close enough to feel. As you acknowledge it, the fullness becomes more coherent. Not sharper coherence here is softness that is settled into a form. You sense the roundness of it, the way it occupies a defined space inside you without pushing outward. This defined space feels warm, dim, and quiet, like a small room within a larger one, a place where emotion rests with its own gentle gravity. Around this inner room, the surrounding emotional field begins to adjust. It smooths itself in response, flattening the little waves of thought and mood that still tried to rise through the quiet. The mind recognizes the need for calm and follows suit, lowering its pace. Even the small background tensions, ones you barely notice during the day, seem to soften as they drift into the dim atmosphere of the night. Your breathing becomes a bridge between the outer stillness and the inner fullness. Without trying, you breathe slower. Each inhale brushes the edges of the feeling. Each exhale allows it to settle further. The rhythm is natural and forced. Breath becomes a gentle companion to the feeling moving with it, like two parts of the same slow tide. It's in this rhythm that the acknowledgement deepens. You begin to understand, not intellectually, but intuitively, that the fullness isn't here to be analyzed. It isn't a problem. It isn't a clue. It isn't a hidden message waiting to be uncovered. It's simply a presence, a quiet internal shape that emerges when there's finally enough stillness to hold it. And the night gives you that stillness freely. You may feel a faint echo of the day beneath the quiet. Not thoughts, not memories, just the emotional residue that lingers after hours of moving, doing responding. That residue usually gets buried beneath activity, but now it appears as a subtle layer beneath the fullness. A layer that doesn't disturb the quiet, but reminds you why this moment of depth feels so grounding. As your awareness drifts across these layers, everything begins to soften into gradients. No defined edges, no hard transitions, just smooth shifts in texture, warmer here, dimmer there, slightly thicker in the space where the fullness rests. You can feel that the inner world has begun to settle into a more unified tone, a tone shaped not by clarity, but by presence. There is a gentle weightlessness to the mind in these moments. Thoughts lose their need to attach to anything. Emotions stop trying to move upward. Everything quiets itself, lowering into the same steady level. The feeling becomes an anchor of softness, holding the rest of your inner world in a calm alignment. You may notice that your awareness now approaches the fullness without hesitation. Earlier, there might have been a slight distance, an instinctive caution that often accompanies unfamiliar internal sensations. But now that distance dissolves. You move toward the feeling with ease, sensing it directly, allowing its shape and temperature to register. Not as information, not as insight, just as sensation. This acknowledgement creates a subtle opening, not outward, but inward, an opening into a quiet emotional chamber where the feeling becomes more transparent, not in meaning, but in presence. You recognize its texture more clearly: smooth, warm, rounded, soft. You feel its tempo, slow, steady, constant. You sense its edges lightly defined, never rigid. And yet nothing inside you demands that you do anything with this feeling. There is no pull to explore it further, no urge to push it away, No need to categorize it. The quiet teaches a different kind of engagement, one where sensing is enough, where the simple act of being present with a feeling becomes the full experience. This is the kind of awareness that emerges only when the mind is allowed to rest without expectation. When you stop trying to control what you feel, when you allow the inner world to exist without needing to justify its shifts. It's an awareness without pressure, without tension, without narrative. As this acknowledgement continues, the fullness doesn't grow. It integrates. It blends with the quiet around it, forming a single soft field of presence. You can still sense its shape, but now it feels more like part of you than something you're observing, a natural part of the emotional atmosphere rather than a distinct point of sensation. Your breathing moves through this atmosphere easily. Thoughts float at the edges without intruding. The night holds everything in a calm balance, and you rest in the center of it all, aware, steady, softly present. This is inner acknowledgement, the moment when you stop watching the feeling from afar and begin to sit with it as something that simply belongs. There is a certain kind of fullness that doesn't rise upward or intensify, but instead shifts downward in the quiet, slowly, gently, like something lowering itself into a softer layer inside you. It isn't heavy. It isn't sharp. It descends with a calm that feels natural in these late hours, as if the inner world finally has room to let things fall into their proper place. You may sense this movement before you fully recognize it, the way you sense a subtle change in air pressure more than you consciously observe it. The feeling broadens first, not in intensity, but in width. It spreads out slightly, making room for its own descent. It's a quiet expansion, the kind that happens when a sensation is preparing to settle. This horizontal widening is soft, steady, unhurried. You sense the space inside you stretching just enough to accommodate the downward motion that follows. The fullness begins to ease into a deeper layer, carrying with it a faint warmth that has grown more even since earlier in the night. This warmth doesn't guide the movement, it accompanies it like a low glow surrounding a slowly sinking shape. Everything about the descent is gentle. There is no drop, no sudden shift. It's more like a slow drift downward, a settling onto an inner surface that has been waiting. As it lowers, the emotional texture around it changes. The air inside you feels thicker, but in a comforting way, like the density of quiet itself has increased to create a cushion for the feeling to rest on. Thoughts slow further, drifting through the mind as muted trails rather than distinct lines. Your awareness becomes broader, less focused, almost as if it wants to give the fullness enough room to continue its movement without interference. You might sense the shift as a soft downward pull. Not a heaviness, but a gentle gravitational settling. Emotional layers that were previously higher in your awareness lower alongside it, aligning themselves with the deeper tone that's forming. Nothing feels forced. The descent happens with the quiet approval of your inner world, the way leaves settle naturally on calm water. The warmth surrounding the fullness adjusts itself as it moves, spreading evenly across the deeper layer. You feel the temperature inside stabilize, becoming consistent across the inner field. This makes the descent feel even more natural, as if every part of you has agreed to allow the fullness to rest exactly where it's going. Your awareness follows not in a direct way, but like a soft shadow drifting behind the feeling. You observe the descent without tightening your attention. You simply let yourself sense it, letting the shape of the feeling guide the rhythm of your perception. Each time you tune in, you notice the fullness becoming smoother, rounder, more at ease. Deeper layers of your inner world open gradually as the feeling settles. These layers are dim but warm spaces that only become accessible when the outer world has grown sufficiently quiet. You may notice subtle textures in this deeper space, slight variations in emotional weight, soft gradients of warmth, tiny shifts that register more as impressions than thoughts. These textures don't require interpretation. They simply exist as part of the internal atmosphere. The descent creates a sense of grounding. Your breath slows again, and you notice the way it moves through the warmth around the fullness. Inhale a soft rising around the sensation. Exhale a gentle settling. This rhythm repeats not because you force it to, but because the feeling naturally begins to align with your breathing. The two movements become intertwined, breath shaping the descent, descent shaping the breath. You may sense a quiet widening around the feeling now as the deeper layer begins to accept it fully. It sinks into place, spreading slightly to fit the shape of the emotional ground beneath it. The surrounding atmosphere shifts in response, smoothing into an even calmer texture. This is the moment where the fullness feels most stable, not finished, not resolved, but steady. In this stability, the internal noise softens into a background hum. Thoughts don't disappear. They simply lose their sharpness, blending into the dim warmth of the emotional space. Nothing interrupts the descent. Nothing rises to compete with it. Everything begins to move in a single unified rhythm, slow, warm downward. This is the nature of depth movement, an inward drop that isn't heavy, a settling that doesn't compress, a deepening that feels like release. You can sense the emotional layers reorganizing themselves around the fullness. The deeper the feeling settles, the more the rest of your inner world adjusts. Small tensions loosen, uneven patterns flatten. Even the faint traces of the day begin to fade into the dimness at the edges of your awareness. The descent becomes a central point around which everything else quietly recalibrates. You may find yourself breathing even more slowly now, as if your entire body is aligning with the pace of this inner shift. The fullness nestles into its new position, warm and quiet, surrounded by a stillness that feels like it belongs there. The air inside feels smoother, the textures more consistent, the emotional field more cohesive. There's no need to rush this moment, no need to define the feeling, no need to reach for meaning. Depth movement isn't about arriving anywhere. It's about settling into the inner quiet that makes movement possible. As the feeling rests deeper within you, you may notice that your awareness grows larger, not sharper, just wider. It expands to hold the fullness in a relaxed, gentle way. The boundaries within your mind soften into a continuous dimness. Everything inside becomes part of the same warm, low arousal space. This deeper position isn't final. It's simply where the feeling needs to be right now. A quiet resting place in a deeper room within yourself. And as it settles, you settle. As it softens, you soften. As it rests, you rest. In this shared stillness, the night deepens around you, and the inner world lowers itself into a calm that feels quietly complete. There is a point in the night where the fullness inside you begins to reveal something beneath it. Not a message, not a memory, but a quieter layer you couldn't feel before. The descent that happened earlier has created enough space for something subtler to rise into awareness. This rising is not upward in any forceful way. It's more like a gentle surfacing, as if a thin layer of feeling has been waiting beneath the fullness, ready to be noticed only when everything above it has softened enough. The shift is delicate. You sense it more through the change in texture than through movement. The fullness that settled deeply now feels supported by something wider, softer, and more diffuse. It's not a second feeling. It's a deeper dimension of the same one. A layer that spreads not vertically, but horizontally quiet warm, almost like an emotional vapor moving through a dim internal space. You may not have words for this layer because it doesn't speak in words. It speaks in sensations, a soft widening across the inside of your chest, a faint loosening around the edges of the fullness, a slow expansion that feels like a sigh forming somewhere deep within you. Nothing sharp emerges. Nothing intense pushes forward. It is all slow, ambiguous, warm. The warmth from earlier settles into a new pattern. Instead of holding the fullness from above, it spreads sideways, aligning itself with this deeper layer. You feel its temperature shift slightly, not hotter, just more even. A balanced warmth that fills the internal space in a way that feels natural, like air settling into every corner of a quiet room. It smooths the surface of the feeling, creating a gentle continuity between the layers. Your awareness moves across this continuity in long, slow arcs. It doesn't hover on the fullness alone anymore. It glides across the entire field, sensing the depth beneath it, drifting into the wider area where this new layer forms. Each pass reveals a little more softness, as if the internal world is opening itself to you in portions, giving you only what you can comfortably feel in the quiet of this hour. There is no urgency in this reveal. The deeper layer doesn't press for attention. It simply becomes accessible because the quiet has thickened enough around you. The mind lowers itself into a calmer frequency, thoughts flattening into thin, muted lines that no longer distract from what is happening inside. In this lowered state, the emotional textures feel more immediate, more present, more honest. What you sense now is not a story. It is not the beginning of one. It is the shape of inner experience in its raw form, soft, unstructured, without narrative. A shape that only appears when the outer noise has died down and the inner world has relaxed enough to show its subtler movements. As you breathe, the deeper layer responds. Each inhale lifts it slightly, like a quiet stirring beneath the fullness. Each exhale allows it to fall back into a wide, calm position. This gentle breathing pattern creates a rhythm across the inner field, as though the feeling is moving in tandem with you, not following your breath, but sharing a cadence with it. You may notice how the deeper layer moves more horizontally than vertically. It spreads outward rather than rising upward. This spreading makes the inner quiet feel larger, more spacious, as if your emotional field is slowly expanding to accommodate a wider range of softness. The expansion isn't dramatic. It's more like the faint unfolding of something that has been folded for a long time. There is a sense of naturalness to all of this. Nothing feels intrusive. Nothing causes discomfort. If anything, there is a slight comfort in sensing the deeper layer. A comfort that comes from feeling something internal rearrange itself into a form that feels more authentic. The night doesn't demand that you understand it. It only gives you a chance to feel it without interruption. The warmth from earlier continues to diffuse, blending seamlessly into the deeper layer. It acts like a soft current moving beneath the fullness, guiding it into a more settled shape. The emotional field becomes smoother, more cohesive. The boundaries between the layers soften until it becomes difficult to distinguish where one ends and another begins. This is not fusion, it is alignment. The fullness aligns with the deeper warmth. The deeper layer aligns with the quiet. Your awareness aligns with all of it. As these elements align, the inner world enters a state of gentle equilibrium. Nothing pulls, nothing pushes, nothing rises, nothing drops. Everything drifts toward a balanced center, a calm plateau, where each layer rests in quiet harmony. You may sense the feeling becoming slightly heavier, not in weight, but in presence. A density that feels grounded, stable, unthreatening. This heaviness is simply the fullness settling into the deeper layer, merging with its wider warmth. It becomes one soft field rather than two separate sensations. Your mind responds with an even deeper quiet. The faint chatter that lingered earlier fades into a dim haze. The world outside exists only as a distant background, barely present compared to the depth forming inside you. The quiet becomes almost tangible, a soft, warm atmosphere that wraps around the fullness and holds it in a gentle stillness. And in that stillness, the deeper layer reveals its purpose, not to explain, not to signify anything, but simply to be felt. This is the essence of inner experience at night, feelings shifting into deeper shapes, not because they must, but because the quiet lets them. The soft inner reveal continues with each slow breath. The deeper layer remains warm and wide. The fullness rests within it, and your awareness drifts gently over it all, sensing the quiet details without needing to grasp any of them. Nothing needs naming. Nothing needs direction. Nothing needs resolution. It is enough simply to feel what the night allows, to surface soft layers unfolding in the dimness, slow movements, returning to stillness, fullness, finding its deeper shape. Everything inside you rests in this shared quiet. There is a moment somewhere between settling and drifting when the fullness inside you stops moving. It doesn't rise. It doesn't sink. It simply pauses, finding a still point within the quiet. This pause isn't rigid or frozen. It's a gentle hold, a suspension, where the feeling remains exactly as it is with no need to shift into another shape. You sense this stillness before you fully realize it, the way you notice the air becoming calm just before the rain stops. The warmth that has been gathering around the fullness becomes steady, now stable, evenly spread across the emotional field. It no longer expands or contracts. It holds. The feeling sits in the center of that warmth, suspended gently, surrounded by a quiet that has grown thick enough to support its weight. Everything inside you begins to match this stillness. Your thoughts slow to a near stop. The breath finds a soft rhythm. The inner world lowers its volume until there is almost nothing left but the quiet hold of the feeling. This is not stagnation. It is a peaceful plateau, an emotional resting point. The fullness has reached a layer where it doesn't need to move any further for now. It has found a place that allows it to exist without tension or gravitational pull. This middle depth, warm and dim, acts like a soft shelf for the feeling to rest on. You sense its presence clearly, but it isn't demanding. It's simply there with a quiet certainty. Your awareness approaches it without hesitation. Earlier, there were layers to move through subtle shifts, to notice textures to follow. Now the internal path is smoother. There's no complexity, no hidden movement beneath the surface. The warmth around the fullness is uniform, creating an even tone across the entire inner space. When you focus your attention, it rests gently on the feeling without sinking into it. When you widen your awareness, the feeling stays where it is steady and unmoving. This steadiness creates a kind of emotional horizon. You can feel the boundaries of the fullness, but they're soft, rounded, almost blurred. Nothing is sharp. Nothing threatens to rise. The edges that once shifted during the descent have relaxed into a quiet shape that feels both present and unobtrusive. It's as if the feeling has reached a natural resting position, one that doesn't require your mind to hold or adjust it. The night deepens as this stillness forms around you. The external world fades further into silence, leaving only the dim, ambient quiet that filters through your awareness. This external quiet mirrors the internal one, creating a sense of symmetry between the outer room and the inner space. The more the feeling holds, the more you feel the night holding you. Your breath becomes subtle, not shallow, just soft. Each inhale brushes lightly across the warmth surrounding the feeling. Each exhale aligns with the stillness, reinforcing the sense that nothing inside you is moving quickly. The breath becomes a gentle companion to the hold, supporting the feeling without disturbing it. As you remain in this suspended state, you may notice that the mind begins to drift into a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness or detachment, but a quiet that feels connected. It's as though your entire inner world has agreed to match the tone of the feeling, slow, warm, unmoving. Thoughts exist only as faint shadows drifting at the edges of awareness. They don't press forward. They don't demand attention. They just drift, carried by the low emotional tide. There is a sense of trust forming in this space. Not trust in a person or an idea, trust in the quiet itself. Trust in the way the inner world settles. Trust in the way the feeling holds without becoming overwhelming. Trust in the way everything aligns when the mind stops trying to shape or interpret what's happening inside. The fullness doesn't feel like a problem. It doesn't feel like something unresolved. It feels like a natural part of the night, resting exactly where it needs to rest. The emotional field feels almost like a landscape now, wide, dim, warm. The fullness sits at its center, like a calm hill, gently rounded, unmoving. The surrounding warmth acts like a soft terrain, supporting it in every direction. Your awareness moves easily across this landscape, sometimes resting on the fullness, sometimes drifting across the warmth, sometimes floating through the quiet without touching anything. In this state, you may begin to feel the stability of the fullness more clearly. It's not a pressure. It's not a weight. It's a gentle anchor, a low point within the emotional field that keeps everything else from drifting too far. Even as your thoughts float, even as your attention moves, even as your breath deepens and softens, the fullness remains constant. It's a quiet center that holds the rest of you in place. This emotional hold is not permanent, but it doesn't need to be. Its purpose is to create a moment of balance before the next shift. A moment where the inner world stops rearranging itself and simply rests. You can feel it in the depth of your breath, in the softness of your shoulders, in the way your mind stops searching for meaning. Everything is allowed to be still. This is the point where the night feels thick, the kind of quiet that presses gently on all sides, not suffocating but protective. A quiet that absorbs the movement of thoughts and the echoes of the day. A quiet that lets the fullness rest in its warm plateau without sinking or rising. The feeling itself may begin to feel slightly lighter now, not because it's leaving, but because the stillness around it supports it so completely. It doesn't have to hold itself. The quiet holds it. The warmth holds it. The inner field holds it. And in this holding, you feel yourself held too. You don't need to do anything with this moment. You don't need to anticipate the next shift. You don't need to guide what happens inside. This part of the night is about allowing the feeling to remain exactly as it is, steady, soft, suspended in warmth. This is the emotional hold, the quiet pause before the drift begins, the still center that makes the next movement possible. Everything inside you rests here without effort, without expectation, without fear. There comes a point after the emotional hold where the stillness inside you begins to loosen, not break, not move sharply, but loosen the way a soft knot relaxes after being warmed by your breathing. It's the start of a drift, the first gentle shift away from the stable plateau the fullness has been resting on. This drift isn't directional. It isn't upward or downward. It spreads instead like a quiet current that moves sideways through the deeper layers of your inner world. You may notice it first as a slight change in density. The fullness, which had settled so steadily, begins to feel less concentrated. Not lighter exactly, just more diffused. As if the warmth surrounding it has begun to seep into the spaces around it, smoothing out the edges that were once softly defined. Nothing about the feeling disappears. It simply becomes more fluid, more willing to move with the night's slow rhythm. This early drift is subtle, almost imperceptible. If you weren't paying attention, you might mistake it for the stillness continuing. But inside, you can sense something shifting, a faint release of tension that you didn't even know you were holding. It's not the kind of release that comes with relief. It's the kind that comes with ease, a small surrender to the comfort of being supported by the quiet. As the drift begins, the warmth that held the fullness starts to stretch across the emotional field. It extends outward in soft gradients, reaching into corners of your awareness that haven't been touched by quiet in a while. This extension doesn't pull the feeling outward. It simply expands the warm atmosphere that surrounds it, making it feel like the inner space is widening to allow the drift to continue gently. Your awareness shifts with this expansion. Earlier, it rested directly on the fullness. Now, it glides across the field around it. You feel the spread of warmth more than the shape of the feeling. Your attention moves in slow sweeps, sensing the way the emotional field becomes softer, smoother, more open. Each sweep reveals a new layer of quiet that has settled beneath the surface. The drift carries a kind of neutrality. There's no emotional charge behind it. No rise, no fall. Just a steady movement into a wider space within you. This wideness feels safe, calm, familiar in a way that is difficult to explain. It's the kind of calm that doesn't need to be earned. It just appears like a natural progression of the stillness that has been building. Thoughts continue to fade into the background, becoming even more indistinct than before. In this phase, they feel like distant echoes rather than clouds drifting across your attention. You're aware of them, but they don't interrupt anything. They exist only as soft ripples on the surface of a much deeper, much quieter body of feeling. The fullness drifts lower in tone, not in depth, but in emotional brightness. What was once a clear, rounded presence becomes a dim glow, warm but faint. This faintness is not about weakening, it's about blending. The feeling begins to merge with the surrounding quiet, forming a softer shape that moves with the internal current rather than holding its own. Breathing plays a quiet role here. Each inhale draws the warmth upward slightly, causing a gentle lift in the emotional field. Each exhale settles the drift back into a horizontal flow. It's as though the fullness has learned to float, drifting gently with each breath, never rising far, never sinking deep, just gliding. You may sense now that the emotional layers have reorganized themselves once again. The deeper layer that revealed itself earlier has grown wider, supporting the drift with a steady base. The feeling rests within this layer, like something buoyant on calm, dim water. The inner world begins to resemble a soft tide, slow and steady moving, without destination. This tide is how the drift continues. Not in waves, not in surges, but in a consistent low movement across the emotional field. This movement doesn't push you toward reflection or insight. It doesn't uncover anything hidden. It simply carries the fullness across the depth where it settled, allowing it to soften even further as it moves. The night deepens alongside this drift. The external quiet blends into the internal one, making the boundaries between the two feel almost non-existent. The room around you feels like an extension of your inner space, dim, warm, and slow. The drift becomes not just an internal movement, but a shared motion between your awareness and the night itself. You may find your body relaxing into this rhythm without conscious effort. Shoulders lower. Breath slows the muscles in your face soften. Even the small tension in your hands dissolves. The emotional drift becomes a physical drift, a gentle letting go of anything your body was still holding on to. As the drift continues, the emotional field becomes smoother still. The warmth seeps into every part of it, erasing any remaining pockets of sharpness. The fullness is no longer a central shape. It's a soft presence that moves with the entire field, indistinguishable from the quiet current that surrounds it. This is the essence of the first drift, a feeling becoming movement, a presence becoming atmosphere, a shape dissolving into a soft flow. Nothing rises. Nothing sinks. Nothing demands. The drift exists for the sake of gentleness itself. As it continues, you sense that the emotional field has reached a level where the fullness can move freely without losing itself. It remains present, but no longer as a defined point. It has become part of a larger quiet, a warm, dim expanse that carries it effortlessly through the night. This quiet motion prepares the way for deeper, slower drifts still to come. But for now, the first drift is enough. A soft release, a quiet shift, a gentle movement across the inner world. Everything inside you follows drifting with the warm, low tide. There comes a stage in the night when the drift that began earlier becomes warmer, wider, and smoother. The fullness inside you, once a defined shape, once a quiet density, now begins to turn into something more fluid, carried by a deeper warmth that grows evenly across the emotional field. It no longer feels like a single point moving. Instead, it becomes part of a slow current spreading through the quiet. This warm drift does not feel like transition. It feels like continuation, the next natural step in how the night softens everything inside you. The warmth no longer surrounds the feeling like a boundary. It blends into the fullness, becoming indistinguishable from it. What you sense now is not a layer holding a presence. It is a presence made entirely of warmth, drifting in a slow, horizontal motion. You may feel this shift first as a subtle widening of your inner awareness. The emotional space inside you stretches gently, giving the drift more room to flow. This widening is soft, unforced, and quiet. It's the kind of expansion that happens not because the feeling grows, but because everything around it relaxes into a deeper stillness. When the mind loosens, the emotional field naturally grows wider, warmer, and dimmer. The warmth itself changes in texture. Earlier, it was a gentle hold. Now it feels like a low glow, diffused through the entire emotional field. You sense it in a way that has no beginning and no center. It is everywhere soft, and even like warmth moving through still air. The drift follows this warmth, floating slowly across the inner space, like something carried by a quiet tide. Your awareness moves with it, not actively, not deliberately. Awareness drifts the way your breath does, softly, involuntarily, effortlessly. You don't follow the drift. You drift with it. The two movements match in their slowness, in their calm, in the way they roll gently through your inner world without disturbing anything around them. Thoughts feel irrelevant now. They still exist faintly at the edges of your awareness, but they no longer have the gravity to pull your attention. They are like dim shapes in the periphery of a foggy landscape, present, but not meaningful. Their outlines fade whenever you turn toward them, dissolving into the warmth that fills the space. It is the warm drift that holds your attention now, not because it demands it, but because it moves in a way that matches the quiet inside you. This drift brings a type of clarity that has nothing to do with understanding. It is clarity born from softness, from the way the fullness blends into the warmth, from the way the emotional field smooths itself out. You feel the contours of the drift the way you feel a faint breeze, subtle, gentle, noticed only because everything else is so still. There's a calm, rhythmic pull beneath the drift. Not a downward pull, not a gravitational movement, but a pull toward even greater softness. As if the warmth is guiding the drift through the simplest path, a path with no resistance. You can feel this low rhythm aligning with your breathing. The drift expands slightly with each inhale and settles into the quiet with each exhale. The two motions, breath and drift, become one slow wave. This wave spreads across all the deeper layers of your inner world. It moves through places that earlier were out of reach, softening textures that felt more rigid or muted. The drift doesn't erase anything. It integrates everything. Each part of the emotional field becomes part of the same warm current. Nothing stands alone. Nothing moves separately. Every emotional layer flows together in a single slow motion. The night deepens as this happens. The external dimness mirrors the internal dimness. The room around you feels quieter, heavier with stillness. The quiet outside no longer feels separate from the quiet inside. They merge, creating an atmosphere where the drift can move with complete ease. This merging makes the warm drift feel almost inevitable, as though it was waiting for this exact level of quiet to emerge. You may feel your body falling into the drift too. Shoulders drop, hands unclench. The space around your ribs loosens. Even the tiny muscles around your eyes soften into the dimness. The body reacts almost automatically to the inner atmosphere, matching the warmth with its own quiet release. As the drift grows warmer, it becomes less about movement and more about presence. The feeling inside doesn't travel across the field as much as it spreads through it. The fullness becomes a tone, soft, low, continuous. A tone that fills the inner space without overwhelming it. You don't sense a beginning or an end to the drift anymore. You sense only its slow, steady presence. This phase is about blending. Blending warmth into quiet. Blending quiet into depth. Blending the feeling into the entire emotional field. Nothing about the drift asks for attention. It's a movement that continues regardless of whether you watch it. And yet it becomes almost impossible not to notice because it creates a gentle cohesion inside you, a sense that all the separate parts of your emotional world have begun to align with the same slow warmth. This alignment feels like floating, not rising, not falling, floating. The drift carries you effortlessly through this internal quiet. You may realize that you haven't tried to interpret the feeling for some time now. The warmth makes interpretation unnecessary. Everything inside you exists in a single low arousal tone that doesn't need explaining. The warm drift prepares the emotional field for what comes next, the gradual lowering of everything into an even deeper quiet. But it doesn't rush. It moves slowly, making sure every part of your inner world eases into its softness. For now, the drift continues in its gentle way, warm, dim spread across your awareness like a soft tide that never reaches shore, moving simply because night makes movement this slow, this warm, this easy. There is a point in the night when the drift that has been moving softly through your inner world reaches a quieter, dimmer layer. A layer where the emotional field doesn't just move, it softens. Everything inside you begins to lose its remaining edges. Shapes blur, textures smooth. The fullness that once felt like a distinct presence becomes something closer to a faint glow, dim and low, spreading evenly through the quiet. You may sense this softening not as a change in the feeling itself, but as a change in the space around it. The warmth expands into a thinner, more diffused layer, wrapping the emotional field in something like a dim hush. Little by little, the drift stops feeling like movement and starts feeling like atmosphere. The inner air becomes thicker with quiet, and the feeling blends into it naturally, the way a faint light dissolves into low fog. Your awareness adjusts to this new level of softness. Earlier, it drifted across the emotional field in wide sweeps. Now it moves more slowly, as if the space has grown heavier with quiet. This heaviness is not oppressive, it is soothing. It presses gently around you, like a softened layer of warmth that encourages everything inside to settle lower, quieter, deeper. Your attention no longer travels quickly. It glides, lingering slightly longer on the field before drifting onward. Thoughts take on a different form here. They don't just fade, they flatten. Instead of moving through your mind as lines or shapes, they appear as wide smudges barely recognizable. They are faint enough that they no longer disrupt anything. Even when they rise, they feel dim, distant, almost silent. The softening makes them part of the atmosphere rather than intrusions into it. As the emotional field softens, you may notice that the warmth at the core of the feeling dims further. Not cooling, not disappearing, just lowering its brightness until it becomes a subtle warm haze. This haze spreads into the deeper layers, creating a kind of emotional fog where all the shapes inside you lose their precision. Everything becomes rounded, blurred, merged into one continuous field of dim quiet. Your breathing sinks into this softness naturally. Inhale a faint lifting of the warmth. Exhale a gentle glide back into the dim layer. The breath does not guide the softening, it aligns with it. The two motions blend, creating a rhythm that feels like being carried by a slow, warm tide. You breathe less to feel, and more to follow the softness the way you might follow the drift of light through a quiet room. This softening reveals how much of the emotional field has changed since the night began. Earlier, there were layers, textures, directions. Now the inner world feels like one continuous plane, smooth, dim, and warm. The fullness that once moved, shifted, and settled is now almost entirely dissolved into this plane. Not lost, not gone, just integrated. The emotional landscape becomes a single tone. This tone is not empty. It is not silence. It is fullness transformed into softness, a quiet density that fills the internal space without forming a shape. You can sense it with your awareness, but you can no longer point to it as one thing. It exists everywhere, evenly, a presence that is softened into something wider than itself. You may feel your body responding again. Muscles slacken. Shoulders fall into a deeper rest. The jaw loosens. Even your posture changes, becoming slightly heavier, as if gravity feels gentler in this low-light softness. It is the body's way of matching the inner quiet, letting the emotional field guide the physical one toward a lower, calmer rhythm. The softening continues as the night deepens. The external quiet blends with the internal one so fully that you no longer sense where one ends and the other begins. The room around you feels dimmer, warmer, quieter than it actually is. The emotional field extends into the space around you, turning everything into part of the same dim atmosphere. This dimness brings a kind of gentle clarity, not sharp, not bright, but the clarity of low light, where only the essential shapes remain. And the essential shape inside you now is not a shape at all, but a presence. A warm, softened presence that moves only with the quiet. As you sit with this presence, you may notice that the earlier drift has slowed to a near stop. It still moves, but only slightly, like the smallest ripple on still water. This ripple isn't strong enough to disturb anything. It serves only to show that the emotional field is alive even in this deep softness. Nothing in this layer asks for interpretation. Nothing asks to be named. Nothing demands attention. Everything simply exists in a low, warm, dim form. Your awareness follows the contours of this dimness, sensing how the emotional field feels wider than before. The softness extends beyond the center, beyond the edges, filling even the parts of yourself that usually stay guarded. There is no resistance left in these layers. Everything has loosened enough to become part of the same quiet field. The night seems to carry this softness forward, the way wind carries mist across an empty landscape. Slowly, steadily moving, only as much as it needs to. You feel the emotional field lowering into an even quieter tone. The warmth smooths down. The dimness thickens. The drift becomes so faint that you sense more stillness than movement. And yet this stillness is not stagnant. It is soft. It is alive. It is absorbing everything into itself. This is what low-light softening feels like, the world inside you, dissolving into dim warmth, the fullness blending into the emotional field, the drift turning into quiet presence. Nothing needs to rise now. Nothing needs to fall. Everything rests on a single soft plane. The night deepens with you, and the inner world settles into the dimness with a peace that asks for nothing more. There is a phase in the night when everything inside you stops softening downward and begins to move in a calmer, more continuous flow. Not a return to earlier drift, not a stirring of new emotion, just a steady, faint motion across the layer where the quiet has fully settled. The fullness that once felt like a shape, then a glow, then a haze, becomes a kind of low, gentle current moving through the dimness. This flow doesn't feel like progress. It feels like the natural continuation of the softness you've already entered, as if the emotional field, having dissolved its sharper textures, now wants only to glide. Nothing pushes it. Nothing directs it. It moves simply because the night is quiet enough for movement to occur without resistance. You may feel this flow first as a slight pull beneath the surface, not downward, not sideways, not upward, just a pull that travels through the warm, softened layer. The feeling glides like a thin wave moving through dim air. It's almost formless, yet you can sense it the way you sense warmth, drifting across your skin, subtle, even undeniable. Your awareness aligns with it naturally. Earlier, you followed the warmth, then the drift, then the dim softness. Now your awareness becomes part of the flow itself. It moves at the same speed in the same direction, or rather, without needing direction. Awareness no longer observes the flow. It participates in it, sliding gently through the emotional field as though carried by the same soft current. Thoughts have little shape now. They pass through awareness, like faint patterns in fog, seen briefly, then absorbed into the warm dimness without leaving a trace. None of them stick. None of them gather momentum. The flow of the inner world is too soft, too stable, too slow for any thought to take hold. Even the act of noticing thoughts feels quiet, distant, unimportant. The emotional field itself becomes more cohesive. Earlier, you could sense layers, the fullness, the warmth, the deeper layer, the softening. Now they blend so seamlessly that no boundaries remain. The flow moves through a single emotional atmosphere, dim, warm, softened. Everything inside shifts to match this atmosphere. The inner world moves in unison with a calm that feels almost physical. Your breathing becomes part of the flow too. Inhale a small rise in the dim warmth. Exhale a smooth continuation of the flow through the deeper layer. Breathing doesn't guide the flow. It complements it. The two rhythms create a subtle harmony, each movement reinforcing the other. This harmony creates a sense of stability, a low, ongoing balance that feels like it could continue indefinitely. In this state, the body responds as if it understands the quiet. Shoulders rest lower. The jaw loosens. The muscles around your eyes soften. There is no tightness left in your posture. Even your hands feel lighter, as though the internal flow has smoothed out the body's own minor tension. The physical and emotional landscapes match in tone, both drifting gently through the dimness. You may find that the inner flow creates a sense of wide presence, not the presence of clarity or insight, but the presence of depth. the emotional field feels larger than earlier, not heavier, just wider, as if more of yourself has become accessible not through thought, but through quiet motion. You sense this depth not because anything has changed, but because the flow allows awareness to move freely through it. The flow is slow, it is soft, it is warm, it is unbroken. These qualities combine to create a kind of emotional continuity. There are no sharp beginnings or endings, no rises or falls. Everything exists in the same tone, the same temperature, the same gentle movement. You may feel as though you are floating inside your own inner world, supported by the warmth that cushions the flow. As the flow continues, it begins to feel less like motion and more like a state of being. The emotional field is not traveling somewhere. It is simply existing in motion. There is no destination, no shift in direction, no anticipation of change. The flow is the experience. It fills the entire inner space with its slow, steady quiet. This quiet is richer now. It is layered soft, dim warm, and now gently moving. The earlier stillness has transformed into a subtle tide. The fullness no longer exists as an object or even as a sensation. It exists as part of the flow, integrated so deeply that you can no longer separate the two. It has become the quiet itself. Your awareness glides through this integrated field, touching nothing sharply. When it moves as smoothly as the flow. When it settles on warmth without sinking. When it drifts with the same faint current that shapes the rest of the night. The internal flow becomes the environment through which awareness travels. There's a softness to this experience that feels almost tender. Not emotional tenderness, textural tenderness. Everything inside feels smooth, safe held. Even the faintest ripple of feeling is cushioned by the warmth. Nothing can rise abruptly. Nothing can disturb the field. Nothing feels out of place. This is inner flow, a quiet carried through the dimness, a warmth spreading without effort, a feeling dissolving into motion. Nothing needs to be resolved. Nothing needs to be held back. Nothing needs to be understood. The night doesn't ask you for anything in this state. It simply carries everything forward in a slow, soft wave. You allow yourself to drift with it, not to reach anything, not to escape anything, but to move in the same gentle rhythm as your inner world. And in that rhythm, the emotional field feels whole, complete in its softness, complete in its warmth, complete in its quiet motion. There's a stage in the night when the inner flow that's been moving gently through you begins to thin out, soften further, and settle into something that feels less like motion and more like melting. Not melting in the sense of dissolving entirely, but melting in the sense of losing boundaries, becoming quieter, more diffused, more integrated with the dim warmth surrounding it. This quiet melt begins slowly. You may notice it first as the flow losing its direction. The subtle current that drifted across your emotional field starts to flatten its movement, becoming almost imperceptible. The warmth that once traveled with it settles into a softer lower layer. Instead of moving through the emotional field, everything begins to rest within it. The feeling doesn't disappear. It spreads. It becomes part of the quiet more completely than before. Your awareness senses this shift in texture long before it recognizes its meaning. The emotional field feels heavier in the gentlest way, not weighted, but dense with quiet. The warmth folds itself into this density, creating a soft, uniform layer across the entire inner space. There are no peaks or valleys, no noticeable pockets of movement, no sharp gradients. Everything blends into a single warm, dim field. Thoughts fade even more. Earlier, they drifted like faint patterns in fog. Now they barely form at all. They rise as thin impressions and dissolve instantly into the melt. They don't need to complete themselves. They don't seek attention. Even the idea of thinking feels unnecessary. The quiet melt absorbs the beginnings of thought before they can form into anything substantial. Your breathing aligns with this deeper stillness. Each inhale lifts the warmth only slightly, like a soft ripple in a nearly still body of water. Each exhale flattens the emotional field again, smoothing everything back into its melted shape. Breathing becomes less of an action and more of a gentle accompaniment to the quiet that surrounds it. You breathe because the body breathes, but the mind is no longer following the breath. It follows the melt. The fullness that was once a distinct presence is now completely diffused. You cannot locate it anymore. You only sense its residue, a soft warmth lingering in the quiet, a gentle density spread thin across the emotional field. It's like tracing the outline of something that no longer has an outline. You know it's there, but you can't point to a center because there is no center left. The feeling has become atmosphere. In this stage, the emotional field behaves like a dim light, covered by many layers of soft cloth. The glow remains, but it is subtle, muted, warm, and even. Nothing shines through brightly. Nothing pulses strongly. Everything rests at the same low brightness, creating a calm that feels both deep and wide. You sense yourself resting inside this dimness, dissolving into it without losing your shape. Your awareness glides across this field in even slower movements. It isn't pulled by anything. It isn't reacting to anything. It explores the quiet, the way you run your fingers across something soft in the dark, curious but unintrusive. The emotional field responds not with movement, but with stillness, allowing awareness to settle wherever it stops. The melt has a tender quality, not emotional tenderness, textural tenderness, a softness so complete that every internal edge becomes rounded. Every trace of earlier tension becomes a faint memory. Every shift in feeling becomes a slow blending. The melt is not about losing yourself. It is about losing the tightness that kept your inner world in defined shapes. As this quiet melt continues, even the drift that came before becomes difficult to recall. You know it happened, but the melt has absorbed its motion, leaving behind only the feeling of warmth that the drift carried. It's as though you've entered a deeper room within yourself, a room where movement is no longer necessary, because the quiet is thick enough to hold everything still. The body responds in kind. Muscles soften further. Breath becomes shallower without strain. The weight of your limbs feels gently supported by the surface beneath you. There is a lightness in your chest, not because emotion has lifted, but because everything has melted into a form that no longer presses against anything. This quiet melt is not emptiness. It is fullness without edges. It is presence without direction. It is warmth without shape. A state where the inner world holds itself warm and dim without needing to organize what it contains. The feeling that once sat inside you is now everywhere, unbroken, uninterrupted. Your awareness rests inside this melt, no longer needing to move. It stays where it lands, because anywhere it lands is soft. The emotional field has no rough surfaces left. Everything is cushioned by warmth. The night feels as though it presses in gently from all sides, not forcing you inward, but holding you in a space where the boundaries between inner and outer quiet blend. In this quiet melt, you may feel the subtle comfort of being held by something vast yet gentle. Not a specific feeling, not a memory, just the sensation of being enveloped by stillness that has finally reached its deepest tone. The melt isn't about letting go. It's about being allowed to rest without needing to understand or adjust anything. The dimness grows thicker, not darker. The warmth grows deeper, not hotter. Your awareness grows softer, not smaller. Everything becomes a single field of quiet presence. Nothing disturbs it. Nothing tries to rise from it. Nothing tries to sink beneath it. The melt is the final level of softness before the quiet begins to deepen into the descent that follows. For now, the melt holds you gently, a soft glow warmed into the dimness, a presence turned into atmosphere, a feeling dissolved into stillness. Nothing more is needed. Nothing more is asked of you. You rest inside the melt, and the melt rests inside you. There is a moment after the melt when everything inside you begins to lower, not in a dramatic drop, not in a collapse, but in a slow, steady descent into an even quieter layer. The emotional field, already softened, already dim, already warm, now shifts downward, the way a gentle fog settles closer to the ground as the night deepens. It is a natural movement, unhurried, unforced, almost weightless. This lowering begins subtly. You may sense the melt becoming slightly denser, not heavier, but closer to the core of your awareness. The warmth that once hovered across the emotional field slowly sinks, spreading into a deeper layer of quiet. It's like watching something glow beneath a surface. The brightness dims, but the glow becomes steadier, more grounded, more stable. The emotional field shifts from floating to resting. Your awareness responds to this by lowering with it. You don't lean downward. You simply follow the quiet as it pulls everything into a deeper, more muted register. Awareness drifts into this lower place, automatically the way a slow tide pulls a small boat farther from shore. There is no sense of loss in this descent, only the sense of settling, of being brought closer to something softer, quieter, more complete. Thoughts that barely existed before now fade into near silence. Even their faint shapes dissolve into the deeper dimness. They don't rise, they don't drift, they don't echo. They simply stop forming. The quiet is too thick, too low, too stable for thought to take shape. This absence of thinking doesn't feel empty. It feels gentle. The mind isn't blank, it is resting. The melt transforms in this lower layer. It no longer spreads. It settles. It no longer shifts. It rests. The feeling that once glowed faintly across the emotional field now becomes a single dim warmth at the base of your awareness. A warmth that isn't confined to a location, but feels central, foundational, as though it forms the floor of your inner world. Your breathing shifts again in response. Inhale, the dim warmth lifts slightly, but only at the surface. Exhale it, lowers smoothly back into the deeper field. You feel this subtle drop with each breath, a gentle downward motion that repeats without effort. The breath becomes a slow descent, each exhale guiding the emotional field into a more grounded state. The quiet around you changes too. It becomes thicker, more stable, more continuous. Earlier, quiet felt like space. Now it feels like depth. A depth that absorbs movement and lowers it into a calm, that feels woven through the entire emotional field. Even the air around you seems to slow, becoming heavier in the way low fog becomes still when the wind stops completely. Your body reacts with its own descent. Shoulders sink. The spine settles into the surface beneath you. Muscles soften as if gravity has become more gentle, more persuasive. The lowering inside you makes the outside feel quieter too, as if everything is being drawn into the same slow descent. You feel yourself resting more fully without needing to try. The emotional field, once layered, once shifting now, forms a single warm depth. You can sense that there are no layers left to move through. Everything has reached the same level, the same tone, the same softness. The lowering has brought all parts of the inner world into alignment. Nothing sits above or below anything else. The descent unifies. This unity brings a new kind of stillness. Not the stillness of the hold, not the stillness of the melt. This is deeper. This is stillness that feels anchored, steady-rooted. You sense it not only in the emotional field, but in the entire inner atmosphere. Even awareness becomes lower, quieter, heavier in the gentlest way. The lowering softens the last remaining edges of feeling. Even the faintest traces of earlier movements dissolve into this depth. The fullness that once guided the emotional journey now becomes something closer to a quiet foundation. Not a presence you observe, but a presence you rest upon. It is the soft floor beneath everything. You may feel a sense of surrender in this stage, not a surrender of meaning or agency, but a surrender of tension. Nothing inside you holds itself upright anymore. Everything relaxes downward into the warm dimness. Even awareness feels supported, as though it is being held from below by the soft depth forming within you. This state is not the end of feeling. It is the beginning of its quietest form. It is emotion flattened into warmth, diffused into dimness, lowered into stillness. Nothing is sharp. Nothing is loud. Nothing rises or presses or shifts. The lowering has released all need for movement. All that remains is quiet presence in its deepest tone. As the lowering continues, the emotional field begins to resemble a calm, low pool. Warm, dim, wide, motionless except for the slightest ripple with each breath. Awareness rests on its surface, drifting only when the breath carries it. This pool of quiet is not empty. It is full of softness, full of warmth, full of the residue of everything that has softened, drifted, and melted across the night. You sense this completeness as a kind of gentle gravity, a pull downward that doesn't weigh on you, but holds you. A gravity that brings your inner world into the same quiet depth. The lowering becomes the final adjustment before everything inside rests fully and without tension. This is what the lowering feels like, a descent without falling a depth, without heaviness, a stillness without emptiness. The night deepens around you and within you. The lowering makes space for the next quiet shift, the next gentle descent, the next layer of rest. For now, everything inside you rests in this soft, dim ground, the emotional floor, where stillness takes its deepest form. There is a moment after the inner world settles into its lowest, softest layer, when the warmth that has been holding everything gently in place begins to fade, not disappear, not cool, but fade in the way a dim light grows softer when the night reaches its quietest hours. This warm fade is not loss. It is refinement. The warmth becomes thinner, lighter, more subtle, as though it's pulling back just enough to let the deeper quiet expand. You may sense this fade first as a change in thickness. The warmth that once felt dense and grounding now feels more like a thin, warm veil stretched across the emotional field. It is still there, still comforting, but no longer enveloping. The quiet underneath it becomes more noticeable, rising gently as the warmth softens. It feels like the emotional field is exhaling long, extended, unhurried. The warm fade spreads evenly. It doesn't retract in one place before another. It dissolves from the entire emotional field, at once becoming a finer layer of the dimness instead of the dominant texture. This dissolution allows you to sense the quiet beneath it more clearly. The quiet is deeper now, more stable, more complete. The warmth had been guiding you. Now the quiet holds you. Your awareness lowers again as the warmth fades. Earlier, it moved downward with the feeling. Now it doesn't move downward, it sinks. Not abruptly, but slowly, like settling deeper into a soft mattress. The sinking is gentle, natural, and it brings a calm that feels slightly different from the calm of the melt or the calm of the hold. This calm is almost weightless. Thoughts do not reappear. They do not try to take advantage of the warmth fading. They stay quiet, barely forming. Even the concepts that might normally arise in these softer states never quite emerge. They appear in the form of tiny impulses, small sparks that die before becoming thought. The warm fade doesn't create space for thinking. It creates space for rest. As the warmth thins, the emotional field becomes smoother. It flattens into a near stillness that feels wide and open. The feeling that began this entire internal movement, the fullness has become so diffused that you can no longer distinguish it from the quiet. It is no longer a presence inside you. It is part of the quiet itself. Your breathing reflects this change. The breath that once lifted the warmth now moves through the dimness without disturbing it. Each inhale feels like a cool glide across a warm surface. Each exhale blends into the warm fade, flattening it even further. Breathing becomes not an action, but an accompaniment, a rhythm that drifts behind the fade. The body responds too. Muscles soften beyond relaxation, entering a kind of neutral state where there is no tension to release. The hands rest quietly, the legs settle deeper, and the chest feels both spacious and low. Even your eyelids seem to breathe, with the warm fade closing more gently with each passing moment. The physical world mirrors the emotional one, soft, dim, low. The warm fade is not withdrawal. It is transition, a shift from warmth as the primary texture of the inner world to a deeper quiet that has been waiting underneath. The warmth still coats the emotional field, but thinly, gently, barely noticeable, except for how it softens the dimness. You may feel a sense of expansion as this happens. The emotional field widens not outward, but inward. It feels larger, more spacious, more open to the stillness that fills it. The boundaries you sensed earlier, faint soft, now dissolve completely. Everything becomes part of the same dim plane. In this plane, the warm fade creates a kind of gentle invisibility. You feel the quiet more than you feel yourself. The warmth is not gone. It simply no longer stands out. It becomes the undertone of the dimness, a subtle background texture. The foreground becomes quiet, quiet so complete it feels like the night has deepened inside your chest. Your awareness floats across this quiet with ease. It no longer needs to look for the feeling, because the feeling has become the quiet. It no longer needs to interpret the warmth, because the warmth has turned into the dimness. Awareness now moves in a steady glide, touching nothing, sharply sensing everything softly. The warm fade also brings a sense of distance, not from yourself, but from anything that once felt close to the surface. Emotional proximity dissolves. Even internal sensations feel farther away, as though wrapped in layers of muted quiet. This distance doesn't create separation, it creates safety. A soft buffer between you and everything you once held tightly. As the warm fade deepens, the inner world reaches a level of stillness that feels almost suspended. Nothing moves, nothing presses, nothing shifts. The warm fade becomes the final step before the emotional field enters its lowest, quietest form. A form that is not empty, not numb, not detached, but deeply, deeply still. You may sense a faint echo within this stillness, but it is not a feeling. It is the residue of warmth turning into quiet. A lingering trace that tells you warmth existed, but no longer needs to hold anything. You feel it only as a soft afterimage, warmth remembered rather than warmth felt. Your breathing becomes even quieter, long, slow, subtle. The rise and fall of your chest becomes the only visible movement in an inner world that has nearly stopped shifting altogether. Each exhale brings a deeper lowering into the warm fade. Each inhale lifts nothing. You remain suspended in dimness. This is warm fade warmth, turning into atmosphere, feeling turning into quiet presence, dissolving into stillness. It prepares the inner world for the next step, the dim quiet that follows a stage where the emotional field no longer needs movement, or warmth, or shape. For now, you rest in the fading warmth, held by the dim quiet, waiting just beneath it. There's a point in the quiet just after the warmth has faded into a thin layer, where the entire inner world begins to move again, but only barely. This is not the earlier drift. This is not the wide, warm movement that carried the fullness across your emotional field. This is a gentler motion, almost like a slow exhale that doesn't belong to your body, but to the quiet itself. A final drift before everything settles into complete stillness. You may notice it as a faint loosening inside you. Not a shift in feeling, but a shift in how the dimness holds that feeling. The emotional field, so wide and soft from the warm fade, now opens a tiny bit more, just enough to let a thin, slow motion glide through it. This drift doesn't travel in a direction. It slides along the surface of the dim quiet, following no path, obeying no gravity. It is movement for the sake of softening the last smoothing before the emotional field comes to rest. Your awareness senses this drift as a kind of gentle lift beneath the dim layer. Earlier, your awareness sank with the warmth as it lowered. Now, awareness drifts lightly, floating across the emotional surface, as if it weighs almost nothing. The dimness carries it rather than letting it sink. It is the closest you come to feeling weightless inside yourself. This drifting sensation can feel like the emotional field is exhaling very slowly, letting go of small remnants of tension that even the warmth hadn't dissolved. These remnants don't rise, they don't flare. They simply get carried away by the drift, absorbed into the wider quiet until nothing distinct remains. The drift smooths out the last uneven textures, leaving behind an emotional plane that feels almost polished. Your breath plays a subtle role here. Earlier, breath guided the lowering. Now breath follows the drift. Inhale, a faint widening of the dim layer. Exhale, the drift becomes slightly smoother, sliding through the quiet like a thin stream of warmth running across your awareness. The movement is so subtle that you could miss it if you weren't feeling it from the inside. Thoughts do not return in this stage. They have no form left to take. Even the impressions that once tried to rise before fading into the melt no longer appear. The emotional field is too soft, too cohesive, too dim for anything to break its surface. The drift is not a disturbance. It is more like the final adjustment, the gentle rearranging that happens when the inner world is almost ready to sleep within itself. As this pre-rest drift continues, you may feel the physical world slipping even further into the background. The room seems quieter. The air seems stiller. Your body feels almost distant, as though the emotional field has taken precedence over physical sensation. Shoulders rest lower. Limbs feel heavier, but the heaviness is soft comforting. Even the weight of your breath feels gentle, like something placed carefully rather than pressed upon you. The drift deepens subtly by spreading. It becomes wider, covering more of the inner space. Not pushing outward, just extending quietly, like a shadow elongating across a dim surface. In this extension, the emotional field becomes even smoother. You may feel as though your inner world has become a single continuous sheet of dim warmth. The drift moves across this sheet like a small wave that barely rises from the surface. Your awareness moves with it, floating across the dimness and resting wherever the drift slows. There is no need to guide your attention. The drift leads, awareness follows. It is an effortless companionship. You don't control the motion. You simply allow it to carry you. And because nothing inside resists, the movement becomes even softer, even slower. This stage is marked by a kind of dim clarity, the clarity of knowing without thinking. You don't understand the drift, but you feel its purpose. It is smoothing the final traces of tension, aligning the emotional field into its most restful shape. Every moment of this drift is preparation. The night is preparing your inner world to enter a state beyond movement, beyond warmth, beyond glow, a state of total quiet. As the drift becomes softer, you may feel a subtle lowering of your awareness again. Not a deep drop like earlier stages. A small, gentle descent, like the settling of dust that had been floating in the quiet air. Awareness becomes heavier in a warm way, sinking slightly toward the dim base of the emotional field, but never fully merging with it. It remains afloat, but lower, slower, quieter. The emotional field now resembles a calm surface at the moment, right before sleep touches it. Wide, dim, smooth. The warm traces that once flowed through it have faded into the background, leaving only the soft motion of the drift. You can sense that the inner world is preparing to rest, preparing to stop moving, preparing to sink into the quiet beneath it. This is the stage where the emotional landscape becomes its most forgiving. Everything feels softened. Any trace of earlier density has been absorbed into the dimness. Even the warmth that once defined the feeling has dissolved into a quiet tone that spreads evenly across the field. The drift is the only remaining motion, and even that feels like it is slowing with each breath. As the drift slows, awareness begins to hover. Not move, not sink, hover. A gentle floating above the emotional field, as if waiting for permission to rest completely. This hovering is peaceful. It is the final pause before the descent into the deep quiet that follows. This is pre-rest drift movement, thinning into stillness, warmth, dissolving into dimness, awareness, floating in a softened field. Nothing rises, nothing pulls, nothing presses. Everything drifts toward stillness. The night has prepared you for this moment. It has softened the fullness, warmed it, drifted it, melted it, lowered it. Now it drifts you into the quiet where rest begins. There's no need to do anything. Just let the drift slow. Let the dimness widen. Let the inner world settle into the quiet forming beneath it. You are almost at the place where everything rests. There is a moment after the final drift when the movement inside you becomes so faint, so delicate, that it no longer feels like motion at all. It feels like the beginning of settling an internal, lowering into stillness that doesn't push downward, but gently places itself against the quiet waiting beneath it. This is the gentle settle, the moment when the emotional field prepares to stop moving and simply rest. You may sense it first as a slowing, not the slowing of breath, not the slowing of thought, those already softened long ago. This is a slowing of the emotional field itself, a reduction in the subtle currents that once drifted through the dimness. The flow that moved softly through the warm layers now begins to thin even further. The drift becomes more of a suggestion than a sensation, something you feel only at the edges, like a faint echo of movement. Your awareness responds by lowering again, but this time it doesn't sink with weight. It reclines. It leans into the quiet, as if the quiet has become soft enough to hold it without effort. Awareness doesn't seek anything now. It doesn't explore. It doesn't follow emotion. It simply rests wherever the emotional field lets it land. This rest feels natural, inevitable, the next step in the night's slow descent. The dimness inside you becomes thicker as the settle begins. It isn't darkness. It is density, quiet becoming more complete, more cohesive. The emotional field flattens again, becoming smoother, wider, and more unified. There are no ripples left from earlier drifts, no brightness from earlier warmth, no shape from earlier fullness. Everything has become part of one continuous surface of dim quiet. Breathing reflects this surface. Inhale, a slight widening. Exhale, a gentle sinking back into the dim layer. But even this rhythm begins to soften. The breath slows until it feels like a small part of the settle, not a separate process. It's as though the body and the inner world have fallen into the same rhythm, a shared slowing, a shared lowering, a shared stillness. Thoughts are almost entirely absent now, not because you are forcing them away, but because there is no room for them to form. The dimness is too complete, too cohesive, too soft. Thought requires tension, contrast edges. The gentle settle flattens those edges into smooth, warm quiet. Any impulse to think dissolves before it rises. Even introspection becomes unnecessary. Feeling is enough. Sensing is enough. Resting is enough. The emotional field, once layered with warmth and movement, now becomes a low, quiet foundation, a steady ground beneath your awareness. You feel held, not by a force, not by a presence, but by the quiet itself. The quiet is foundational now, not atmospheric. It forms the emotional floor. The settle lays your inner world across this floor, smoothing it out until nothing remains above the surface. Your body responds with its own settling. Muscles loosen further. Limbs grow heavier in the gentlest way. The jaw softens. The breath becomes shallow without strain. You feel the weight of your body, not as pressure, but as support, something grounding, something still, something quiet. It is as if the physical world is matching the emotional one in tone, following it into stillness. What remains of warmth is faint now, only a soft undertone in the dimness. It doesn't act as a layer. It doesn't move. It doesn't surround anything. It simply lingers as a low temperature throughout the emotional field, like the last remnants of heat in a quiet room. This faint warmth makes the settle feel safe, familiar, comforting. You rest not in cold quiet, but in warm quiet. Awareness drifts, but only because it is resting. There is no direction to follow, no movement to accompany. The drift is gone. The melt is gone. The earlier fullness is gone. All that remains is the quiet, and your awareness resting within it. The gentle settle turns the emotional field into something like a soft bed-wide dim even, and awareness lies down on its surface. You may notice that even the idea of noticing begins to fade. Awareness becomes passive, like a surface being touched by quiet, rather than a presence observing the quiet. The distinction between awareness and emotional field softens. They exist in the same low space, sharing the same tone, the same warmth, the same stillness. The settle deepens with every moment. The dimness becomes more uniform. The warmth becomes thinner, but never leaves. The emotional field lowers until it becomes nearly indistinguishable from the quiet beneath it. This is not emptiness. It is fullness that has become stillness, a complete gentle rest of everything inside you. As the settle continues, the inner world begins to feel suspended. Not floating, not sinking, simply resting in place, as though gravity has softened too. The quiet is thick enough to hold you, warm enough to comfort you, deep enough to keep you grounded. You sense that no part of you is resisting this descent. Everything agrees to rest. This is the stage where movement ends, where warmth becomes background, where dimness becomes structure, where awareness becomes stillness. The night reaches its deepest quiet, and your inner world meets it. Nothing needs to be done. Nothing needs to be undone. Nothing needs to be held or released. The gentle settle is complete when your awareness rests without needing to move. And you can feel that moment approaching soft, slow, quiet, warm, a final place of rest before the night carries you into stillness. There is a moment after the gentle settle has lowered everything inside you into its softest position when the inner world shifts into something even quieter. Not deeper, not warmer, just quieter in a way that feels almost impossible to disturb. This is the beginning of dim rest, the stage where the emotional field stops preparing to rest and actually begins to rest fully, softly, without movement. You may sense it first as the disappearance of the last traces of motion. Earlier, even in the settle, there was a faint sense of lowering, a slight shift in the dimness. But now there is none. The emotional field becomes perfectly still, not frozen, just resting in a way that no longer requires effort or adjustment. The quiet beneath everything rises to meet the quiet inside you, and the two become the same. Your awareness no longer feels like something separate. It no longer follows, no longer sinks, no longer drifts. It rests, fully, softly, without needing to track anything. Awareness becomes something like a small glow floating above a dim surface, but even that glow feels faint, like it's dimming itself to match the softened world around it. Breathing shifts again, but so delicately you barely notice. Inhale, a slight widening in the dimness. Exhale, a soft return to the same still layer. The breath doesn't move the quiet anymore. It only glides along the surface of it. The emotional field no longer responds with movement, it responds with stillness. Breathing becomes a companion to the quiet, not a guide, not a mirror, just a companion. Thoughts are fully gone now. Not suppressed, not pushed away, gone in the way shadows disappear when the sun sets completely. Even the faintest impressions that arose earlier in the melt or the drift no longer appear. The dim rest makes thinking unnecessary. The emotional field is too soft, too unified, too still for thought to find any space to form. Your mind is not empty, it is quiet. You may feel a slight sensation of fading inside you, not fading away, fading into dimness, into stillness, into the soft, warm tone that now covers the emotional field. It is not the warmth from earlier stages. This warmth is thinner, more delicate, like the faint heat that lingers in the air after the sun has set long ago. It is warmth that rests rather than moves. Your body reflects this stage with its own form of rest. Muscles soften into the surface beneath you without collapsing. Your limbs feel still, not heavy. Your chest feels open, not stretched. Even the small muscles around your mouth and eyes soften into the dimness. The physical body stops adjusting itself. It stops seeking comfort. It simply rests in place. The emotional field becomes something like a quiet floor, soft, dim, gently warm. A floor on which your awareness can lie without needing to brace itself. You sense the field supporting everything, not holding it up, not pressing it down, supporting it in the way a calm lake supports a leaf effortlessly, gently, completely. The dim rest has no movement. Instead, it has texture, a low, smooth warmth that spreads evenly across your inner world. A texture that feels like a mixture of breath and quiet warmth and dimness, softness, and groundedness. You don't need to understand it. You only need to feel it as it holds you. Awareness no longer shifts position. It rests wherever it lands, and the place where it lands feels soft, safe, quiet. This resting is the final stage before the emotional field enters its deepest stillness. The dim rest prepares you for that in the gentlest way possible by dissolving everything that might disturb it. You may notice that the dimness feels wide now, wider than earlier in the night, as if the emotional field has expanded beyond the boundaries of your inner world. The quiet around you merges with the quiet inside you until the difference becomes meaningless. You no longer feel like you exist in a body resting in a room. You feel like you exist inside a wide, dim quiet that wraps around everything. This widening is not disorientation. It is release. A release from any sense of containment. A release from any sense of boundary. A release from any sense of having to hold yourself. In dim rest, you are not contained by the quiet, you are part of it. The emotional field becomes so smooth that it feels like nothing could disturb it. Even if a thought tried to rise, it would dissolve before it reached awareness. Even if a feeling tried to form, it would soften into the dimness. Even if your breath shifted slightly, the quiet would absorb it instantly. Dim rest is not numbness. It is not detachment. It is not emptiness. It is fullness that no longer needs to move. Warmth that no longer needs to rise. Quiet that no longer needs to deepen. It is the point where your inner world stops trying to go anywhere and simply settles into the stillness the night has prepared for it. As this rest deepens, the boundaries between awareness and emotional field soften even more. You can feel yourself becoming quieter, slower, dimmer, not in a fading sense, but in a settling sense, like a feather landing on a soft surface, finally still after drifting through layers of air. This is the moment the inner world begins to feel complete, not resolved, not explained, not processed, complete. The dim rest gives you a place to exist without effort, without tension, without movement. It is the quiet the night has been guiding you toward through every drift, melt, soften, and settle. And now that you've reached it, nothing more needs to shift. You rest inside the dimness. The dimness rests around you. And together, you form a single quiet stillness. There is a point in the night when even the dim rest, the soft, settled quiet you've been drifting toward, begins to dissolve into something deeper. Not a deeper layer to move into, not a deeper feeling to uncover, just deeper stillness. A stillness so complete that it no longer feels like something inside you. It feels like the atmosphere your awareness is floating in. This is the final stage, the moment when everything becomes quiet enough that nothing needs to move ever again. You may sense it first as a pause, not a pause from movement, because movement has already faded. A pause from even needing to sense the quiet. The emotional field no longer shifts, no longer opens, no longer lowers. It simply stays, smooth, dim, unmoving. The quiet is not something you observe. It is something that surrounds you, holds you, dissolves into you. Your awareness becomes almost transparent here. It doesn't glow, doesn't rest, doesn't float the way it did earlier. It simply exists, softly, quietly, without edges, without weight, without purpose. Awareness in this stage is not a presence. It is a condition, a gentle openness that doesn't track anything, doesn't follow anything, doesn't anticipate anything. It just allows the stillness to exist around it. Breathing too becomes quieter than you can register consciously. Inhale the faintest lift in the dim air. Exhale a smooth flattening that barely shifts anything. The breath is no longer a rhythm, but a background. Something happening quietly beyond the stillness. Something so soft that it blends into the emotional field rather than shaping it. Thoughts do not return. Even the faintest flickers of impression that might have lingered earlier no longer rise. The stillness is so complete that it absorbs even the impulse to think, not suppressing, absorbing. The mind cannot create shapes in this level of quiet. There's nothing for thought to hold on to nothing, for it to move toward nothing, for it to escape from. It rests by simply not forming. Your body feels far away in this stage, not distant in the sense of detachment, distant in the sense of being unnecessary to the moment. Physical sensation becomes part of the stillness, not numbness, but softness. Warmth without temperature, weight without pressure. Your limbs feel like they've sunk into the quiet held by something that doesn't push back and doesn't pull down. The emotional field becomes completely uniform, a single warm dimness stretching across the entirety of your inner world. No layers, no movement, no textures, only stillness that feels like a soft surface you're lying on, and a quiet air you're breathing in, and a gentle warmth resting beneath everything. The world inside becomes one continuous atmosphere. Awareness blends into this atmosphere. It doesn't rest on the stillness, it rests as stillness. There is no center to the feeling, no boundaries between emotional layers, no distinction between inside and outside. Everything merges into a single tone, low, warm, dim, silent. You may notice that even noticing becomes softer. Awareness doesn't try to examine the stillness. It doesn't try to understand what stage it's in. The idea of stages slips away. What remains is simply the feeling of being held by quiet that no longer needs attention to stay present. The stillness holds itself. Your breath becomes part of the background. Your awareness becomes part of the dimness. Your emotional field becomes part of the quiet. The gentle settle has finished. The dim rest has finished. All that remains is the stillness that follows. This stillness is not heavy. It is not empty. It is not reflective. It is neutral, soft, quiet, complete. As the stillness deepens, you sense that nothing inside you needs to be maintained anymore. There is no residue of movement left, no lingering warmth to spread, no drifting to follow. Everything has reached equilibrium. Everything has settled into the same low, quiet state. Your awareness softens so much that it feels almost horizontal, as if the inner world is a soft field and your awareness is lying flat upon it, resting, breathing, existing without movement. The stillness deepens, not because it grows, but because your awareness becomes quieter, more open, more willing to dissolve into it. This stage feels like the night reaching its final point of quiet. Not the quiet just before sleep. Not the quiet between breaths. The quiet that comes when everything, every thought, every warmth, every drift has completed its motion and is now resting at the same level. The emotional field feels like a slow horizon, wide, soft, stable, motionless. You do not need to do anything with this stillness. You do not need to observe it. You do not need to hold on to it. You simply exist inside it. The stillness becomes the environment. It becomes the air. It becomes the surface beneath your awareness. It becomes the temperature of the emotional field. It becomes everything, and you become part of it, quiet, dim, warm, still. This is complete stillness, the end of movement, the end of lowering, the end of drift, the end of warmth unfolding across layers. It is the point where the inner world stops doing and begins simply being. You rest within it. It rests within you. Nothing more needs to shift. Nothing more needs to rise or fall. Nothing more needs to soften or melt or lower. This is the quiet the night has been leading you toward. Deep, soft, silent, complete.